I went no contact with my Nigerian father following a lifetime of chronic non-contact sexual abuse that started when I was 16. Today, I'm going to be talking about what started happening when I started talking about my story and telling more people, especially inside of my family. Hi, my name is Ikwo. I am deconstructing all of my performative identities. So while I've been a writer, filmmaker, entrepreneur, and many other multi-hyphenate things, for now, you could just say I am healing in public. So if you watched the first video, you know that when I first called the radio psychologist, the late Dr. Joy Brown, she told me it was my fault, and I internalized that, had a lot of shame and guilt around the CSA. And then I remember telling another friend, I think it was the summer after my junior year, I did this like youth theology program and hung out with a couple friends in New York City. I actually grew up in upstate New York, but I came to meet them in New York City and we hung out. And one of them mentioned that her dad does that too. I know, what the actual fuck, right? I never really asked her, what do you mean? Does he, like, you'll be in a room with him and he's looking at you and he's masturbating? Or is it like you come downstairs and he's on the couch masturbating? Like, I didn't really ask her what was up with that. But more than once I experienced people kind of minimize when I said, oh, my father masturbated in front of me. Now, I don't know if they all asked me the details of exactly what had happened when I was 16. And certainly I don't remember explaining to people that he was like continuing to like peer at me, like look at my body and things like that. So maybe they didn't exactly know what I was talking about. So you might be starting to grasp why it took me so long to understand that this was actually a kind of sexual abuse, because so many people were acting like it was normal, or it was my fault that something happened, or like, why am I overreacting? The first time I actually mentioned it to a therapist was when I was at Stanford for undergrad. I did a semester exchange to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And I met with the therapist there because I was experiencing a lot of depression and issues like anxiety and hypervigilance. It was almost funny because I kept showing up and performing in therapy like everything was good. Like, oh, class is this and I'm making friends. And it wasn't until the very last session, I was there for a whole semester, it wasn't until the last session where the thing I'd wanted to say from session 1 finally came out of my mouth. And I said, my father masturbated in front of me. And the therapist, I remember her name, but I'm not going to mention it here, her face fell. But because it was our last session and I was expected to return to Stanford, she kind of like gathered herself and told me I had to forgive him. When she said that, I think I really clung to that. Like, oh, I just have to kind of let it go and forgive him for what he has done. Again, I didn't really get into details with her because I was telling her at the final session and I was about to fly back to Stanford. But what was interesting is I actually considered staying at Spelman and transferring simply so that I could meet with her, because that was the first time I'd actually ever really been honest with somebody face to face about what had happened. And I was really deteriorating so much in terms of my mental health being at Stanford. So because I was in Atlanta at Spelman first semester of my junior year on the East Coast, I actually flew back to celebrate my birthday in Albany with my mom in October. And it ended up being our last birthdays together. Her birthday is actually 2 days apart from mine. So this is our final birthday together. And what's interesting is at the end of the semester over Christmas break, went home to Albany, and I was really deteriorating a lot in terms of my mental health, and I had basically told my family I was experiencing depression. My mom had known I'd been diagnosed in high school, but I hadn't really said it to anybody else. And it's almost funny to me now. My dad calls this whole family meeting and he says the biggest problem the Essien family has ever faced is Ikwo's depression. Now, at the time, I was just, it was almost like a Cosby Show type situation where me and my sister would be sitting around the living room, and my dad would be in his recliner, my mom would be on the couch, and we'd all be having this like, how are we going to solve this as a family? And it's almost funny to me now, because those family meetings are the same family meetings where my mom would accuse my dad of infidelity. Sometimes she would end up like pounding her fists on the floor, making a whole scene. As in, the family has faced a lot of challenges, but it seemed very convenient for my dad when I announced that I had depression that he could all of a sudden erase all the other challenges and say my depression is the biggest problem we've ever faced. we had this whole family meeting. My mother, after it, she put together a list of therapists for me to call when I got back to Stanford so that I could actually go back to school and not transfer. And do you know, funny enough, in 30 years since then, almost 30 years, my father has never once asked after my mental health. It was all a show. He's never asked me, how are you doing with that depression thing we talked about that time? But I digress, because almost immediately after Christmas break, I think it was in January actually, that my mom was diagnosed with cancer. So essentially, the issue that had been raised around my mental health was then subsumed by the fact that my mom was facing terminally ill, was facing terminal cancer. And so we, as much as possible, rallied as a family for her. She convalesced through the summer, and then she passed away the beginning of my senior year. So you could say after my mom passed, and even after graduation when I had to move back to Albany for about a year and live in the house with my dad, thank God one of my sisters was there, because I was never really comfortable in the house or around him. And then finally I got a job in New York City and left and just moved away. But New York City's not really that far from Albany. It's like 2 hours, 45 minutes. But at least I didn't have to be in the house with him. So you could say I wasn't really thinking that much about this kind of issue that I'd been having. But that was the time in my mid-20s when I finally met with a therapist who said, this is sexual abuse. Because even that first therapist asked Wellman, she never said that's sexual abuse. She just said, forgive him. So finally, I spoke to a therapist who said, oh no, what you experienced was actually sexual abuse. And I was like, oh, really? Because I just had not known. And, but oddly enough, maybe not oddly if you actually know me, because I'm pretty much a witch and I'm very woo-woo. I spoke to a psychic and asked her about what I should do. And she'd actually told me that if I confront my father about it, which is something at that time I was thinking I would do, that it wouldn't bring us any closer, that he wouldn't really hear me. And she said, you have a greater chance of him hearing you if you talk about this on his deathbed. And I literally just I lodged it in my mind, because I thought to myself, if you go and talk to him about this thing and he denies it, you're probably going to hate him and resent him and not even want to talk to him anymore. And then you're going to be all estranged from your family. And you recently lost your mother. You all need to kind of come together. So I think I just kind of suppressed everything inside, because I just thought this probably makes more sense than me talking about this inside of the family. So I just kind of write it down, write about stuff in my journal. And at that time, I still didn't really understand that any of the symptoms I'd been experiencing this whole while, all of the behavioral issues that had my parents saying I was a bad kid and had an attitude, that they were actually all connected to this CSA. I really didn't know at that time. But it still was in my mid-20s when I first mentioned it to my sisters. I told my eldest sister and the sister closest in age to me first, the two of them together. They did not look surprised or shocked at all. Till date, I can still remember the looks on their face, and they're just like, oh, okay. And my eldest sister offered to go with me to talk to him about it and confront him or whatever. But obviously I'd already spoken to the psychic. But then I just decided against it. And that I was basically going to suffer in silence like my mom did in her marriage. I know. But when I finally got around to telling my other sister, the one who is in between age of those two, she actually said, well, don't all men do that? I know, what the actual fuck. When she said it, I was shocked. But in hindsight, I now understand the levels of denial people have to go through in order to maintain what they see as the status quo of their life. Because if they actually engage it, they have to start unpacking all of these things. And it's actually that sister who's maintained kind of that level of ignorance for the past 2 decades with respect to these topics. Every time I try to discuss them with her, she'll claim she doesn't know what I'm talking about. But then she'll say, oh, I'm a physician, I do 24-hour shifts, and I have a problem with short-term memory loss. So I don't know if she's completely gaslighting me or not, but I've been talking about these things literally for 2 decades. Every time I bring it up, she will say she does not know what I'm talking about. And she also, when I reminded her that she told me, oh, don't all men do that, she claims she doesn't remember saying that. And I'm like, I could never make that up and I could never forget it. I think when I talk about this, there's a set of attitudes which is kind of to minimize it and say this is just normal, nothing really happened, like, and basically, who are you anyway? Like, life is life, move on. And then there have been people who are like, this is abuse. I can't believe somebody did that. I remember telling one of my friends in film school who didn't grow up with her dad. And I remember her saying, well, why would he do that? She's like, I always had this fantasy that if my dad was around, my life would have been perfect. And I can't even imagine that some dads would do that. But from my mid-20s to my early 40s, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I essentially just soldiered on. I didn't bring it up that much, but whenever my dad would do something inappropriate, like there was this whole incident where he, I think he thought he was DMing an OnlyFans model. I don't know if she was on OnlyFans, but one of these big booby women. And instead of DMing, he actually put the photo up on his Facebook wall, and it happened to coincide with his birthday, and my sisters were in the sisters chat. Who's going to tell Daddy to take off the photos? Who's going to tell him to take down the photo? Everyone is going to his Facebook, and they're going to see this woman with these big boobs. And I went in the thread and I said, I have been talking about his inappropriate behavior for years. I don't know why you think I need to be a part of telling him to take it down. He's a grown man. He's responsible for his actions. And I remember my eldest sister getting so mad and upset with me that she like ghosted the thread after like giving me some few choice words. And that would typically be their reaction. I would remind them. It probably felt to them like I was keeping tabs. But I continued noticing. Obviously, I was experiencing this non-contact CSA, right? But then I was noticing that his behavior was always, he likes breasts. He likes women. And I was just seeing it. So every time it would happen, I would go on the text thread and I would put a few bullet points, as I said. And the way that I was framing it at that time, I started framing it in my late 30s, getting to my 40s. I was saying his behavior is consistently inappropriate. Something needs to be done about this. I think it is a crisis of leadership for our family, because I was actually watching the deterioration of our family after my mom passed away. I'm pretty much the family historian. I'd started writing. I didn't know I was working on a memoir at that time, but I'd started writing family history, interviewing people, all that. I'd even gone back home to Nigeria right after graduation to celebrate my mother's memorial in the village. And so I had been really connecting with my family, my history, our family history, all of that. And in a sense to just kind of keep the family together. Because I had never taken my eldest sister up on approaching my dad, confronting him and having a conversation that I guess at that time she assumed she would mediate. I don't know if they just took it as, oh, it's fine, it's water under the bridge now. But because I continued to have more healing, I was continuing to go to therapy. And then by 2023, I had a breast cancer diagnosis. And that is really when the shit hit the fan. In the next video, I'm going to talk about why my breast cancer diagnosis actually woke me up to the fact that I was living in a toxic patriarchal family system and helped me get out of it.